What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so getting into really the conclusion of Batman: The Return of Bruce Wayne. Again, for those of you guys who are just joining us, this largely comes after the events of Final Crisis, when Batman was sent to the very early days of time, and where he's kind of been jumping forward through time. For the most part, one of the big caveats with this is that his memory was effectively wiped. Now, of course, we'll actually find out the motivation behind this, and that there's actually a very particular reason why this was done. But the whole ideology behind this is that it kind of allows Grant Morrison, the writer of this story, to kind of craft these intertwining scenarios whereby we basically end up learning Bruce Wayne guarantees his own existence. But in regards to Dark Knight's Metal, one of the things that went on with that whole line of stories is we basically learned there was a bat god out there called Barbados that existed in the dark multiverse. And the whole motivation was to basically try to find a way to enter the positive multiverse and then destroy it, which he's basically entered the positive multiverse at the moment. And then we're kind of in the process of watching it be destroyed because everybody seems to have no chance to win. But what the Return of Bruce Wayne does is it kind of serves this purpose of being a bridging gap between the events of Dark Knight's Metal and what it is that led to the introduction of Barbados, and why it is that his character is so significant to the life and times of Bruce Wayne. So again, when Bruce was thrown all the way back into the early days, that's when Barbados first noticed him. And that's when Barbados came to the realization, I can use Bruce Wayne as a means to enter the positive multiverse. Now, in terms of why it was Bruce Wayne, it seems to be more of he was just chosen. Plus, I mean, he's Batman, so it kind of makes sense. But the other idea is that it really was kind of a bonding process, in the sense that in order for this gateway to kind of be opened, Bruce had to be exposed to various metals over the course of his life. And that's what Dark Knight's Metal does, where Dark Knight's Metal comes along and says, over the course of Bruce Wayne's existence, during this story, he was basically exposed to these different metals through a series of events. What it does is it grabs this story and it kind of throws information in that wasn't here originally. But in the previous comic, we had talked about how he basically had been thrown into the age of pirates, and that now he'd been kind of sent to the age of cowboys, more or less. But one thing to keep in mind is that what this initially does is it picks up with a guy who's referred to as Monsieur Savage. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Monsieur Savage is actually Vandal Savage, and we had talked about that in the first video we did on the Return of Bruce Wayne. Vandal Savage, and this is how all that Dark Knight's Metal stuff kind of ties together. Vandal Savage was originally just a guy who was basically exposed to a meteor, I think it was, which basically granted him eternal youth. Now, the same thing was done to a guy named the Immortal Man. But when DC rebooted in 2011, writer Scott Snyder came along and said actually what it was is it was a substance called Dionysium. And this substance was basically, exposed to or consumed by Vandal Savage when it was in his most pure form. For the sake of this video, assume that it all kind of comes out of New 52, in the sense that Vandal Savage is immortal because he gained access to Dionysium, he consumed it, and that's why he's able to do the kind of things he does. But he's been a recurring theme. He's played a multitude of different roles over the course of this life he's held for, however many thousands of years since the very early days of man. The other half of this is that this also deals with a handful of criminals who are pursuing a box that has a Batman insignia on it. And of course, there's only really, this woman who's here is the one who can kind of decipher it, a woman by the name of Catherine. And then of course, she's taken by the forces of Vandal Savage and brought to his location. But what it does is it brings in the character of Jonah Hex. Now, of course, again, we talked about this in the last video, so you're welcome to reference that if you want to learn more about his character. But Jonah Hex was always one of these weird scenarios, in the sense that he was a character that was kind of like, living in the Old West, and he was, the world's best bounty hunter, and he was the fastest gun in the West, had his own line of comics that really pertained directly to him. There were stories that would see him kind of thrown into the modern day, but more often than not, Jonah Hex is just kind of associated with the Wild West in the DC landscape. But the fact that he is the best bounty hunter is the reason why he's been contracted by Vandal Savage, because having Jonah Hex here is designed for the purpose of the fact that after this woman, Catherine, had basically lost her son, everything that she cared for, she had basically reached out and said, God, give me some avenging angel that will take his revenge on these men, which is when Batman had kind of shown up, when Bruce Wayne has shown up. Now remember, he's basically catapulted in time. He doesn't willingly choose to time travel. He doesn't willingly decide what place he goes to. He's just sent there. But like we would expect, his detective skills are somewhat subconscious, and that means that in every generation, every era that he appears in, he basically becomes that era's version of Batman. He immediately shows up in Gotham town. Now remember, a lot of this stuff takes place around the city of Gotham. For the most part, it's kind of intertwining and part and parcel to that landscape. There's a few instances where it moves beyond the realm of Gotham, but it largely focuses around Gotham's vicinity. I mean, at this point in time, Gotham's not fully fleshed out. It's not a great big huge town. It's really more of like a settlement than anything anything else. We also end up finding out that this woman is basically being exposed to a series of different hallucinogenic drugs and different things like that. They're designed to kind of bring out the nature of what's in this box, what it means, and why it's so important, because that's the question everybody wants, as well as getting her to open it up. Now, again, this is pretty intriguing and it's kind of cool, because the whole idea of Jonah Hex being brought here, we end up finding out, is for the sole purpose of protecting Vandal Savage. Because remember, where Vandal Savage could jump in and Vandal Savage could fight Batman, he relies in much the same way as Batman on secrecy and guile. And people can't know that he's immortal. If they do, they'll seek the means to immortality, just like he was able to gain it himself. And so the result is keeping it all kind of hidden, keeping his true nature secret from a lot of different people. And so, of course, with Batman attacking these various forces of Vandal Savage, things really kind of progress exactly as you would expect them to. You know, they basically end up really just kind of getting wrecked left and right, so on and so forth. You end up having Vandal Savage and a guy named Thomas Wayne basically board a carriage along with this woman and take off. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind is this character of Thomas Wayne, because he's not who he claims to be. He is, but he isn't. He's really more well known by another name, which is Simon Hurt, and we'll actually find out a little bit more about that here in a second. But it is a cool little bit here, just because of the fact that this woman basically continues to refuse to open the box. Not only that, she's a member of the Miyagani. And so what this means is she's a descendant of the Bat Tribe. Again, keep in mind that when it comes to Dark Knight's Metal and in the confines of this story, when Batman was thrown back all the way to the earliest days of mankind, in order to keep his memory intact, or at the very least, try to maintain some identity of who he is, he started scribbling drawings of, you know, Wonder Woman symbols and Superman symbols and his own symbols, so on and so forth, but he was wearing his cloak and cowl. And so because humanity was so primitive, when he initially took off his cloak and cowl and kind of threw it on a mantle, people saw that and they immediately thought it was a symbol of like a greater god or something along those lines. And that's where worship of the Bat Tribe began to start. Now from there, it just kind of progressed over the years the way that you think it would. Legend gave way to myth, and that's when we start to get into the idea of the character of Barbatos. Because with this particular story where this carriage comes flying down the road, you know, they end up running into Alan Wayne. Of course, Alan Wayne is in the process of, you know, ending his own life, but chooses not to, ultimately comes into contact with Catherine, and the two of them basically fall in love, and they end up getting married to one another, so on and so forth. Of course, Jonah Hex showing up and Jonah Hex shooting Bruce Wayne falling into the water, and basically waking up in the 1930s. What it did is it set in motion the nature of Alan Wayne. Remember, what we know is that Alan Wayne was basically the guy that developed Gotham City. He developed Wayne Manor. He's the one that led to like a lot of these major buildings being constructed. But also keep in mind, the Court of Owls is currently in existence. And that's where Dark Knight's Metal really begins to intertwine with the nature of the return of Bruce Wayne. Because the timeline really kind of falls like this. You basically ended up having the formation of the positive multiverse and the formation of the dark multiverse. And the whole idea was that Barbatos was just one of these beings that existed out there that was designed to basically destroy worlds that were not supposed to exist. When Bruce Wayne was thrown back into the early days of humanity, Barbatos took notice of Bruce Wayne. And so what he ended up doing was saying, there's a way for me to enter the positive multiverse. This of course came after various instances where he tried to enter and was ultimately defeated. But because of the fact that Bruce Wayne had led to the formation of the Bat Tribe, what this meant was that as this tribe began to grow, as it began to sort of progress throughout the era of time, where it was predicated on Bruce Wayne, Barbatos kind of co-opted it and basically said, well, no, what you guys have actually been worshiping is me, and you guys need to find a way to bring me into the positive multiverse, preying on the idea that a lot of the later generations, hundreds of years down the line from the original dawning of the Bat Tribe, the people at the time didn't really know where it originated from. They just knew whatever legends were handed down, and it all stemmed from a bat god. And so again, that's why it was also intriguing, and that's why it really works, is because this writer Scott Snyder grabbing what Grant Morrison did in this story, reworking it a little bit, and then rolling it over into Dark Knight's Metal. And so of course, with Bruce Wayne arriving in the 1930s, it is kind of interesting because again, this also deals with the modern day, which is to say the Justice League trying to figure out a way to save Bruce Wayne or try to get him back to the modern era. Now again, that's really more of like an afterthought to the story. The bulk of everything that goes on focuses almost exclusively on Bruce Wayne. But notice this, Bruce Wayne's met by the arrival of a woman named Marsha Lamar. Now on the surface, she doesn't really seem to be that important. In fact, she'll actually be exceedingly important. But Marsha Lamar basically shows up and says, you just kind of appeared, you're just kind of there, but what I need is someone who basically has no name. I need a man with no real identity that can help me solve a murder. And when the question is asked, well, whose murder needs to be solved? It's the murders of Thomas and Martha Wayne. What this means is that Bruce Wayne is an adult at the same time that he's a child, and he's basically trying to solve the murder of his own parents. what we end up having is, Marshall Lamar present Bruce Wayne with a kind of bat outfit, so to speak. Now, the reason why this matters and the reason why it's so important is because this outfit stems from the fact that the mother of Bruce Wayne, Martha Wayne, is part of the Miyagani. Either that or it was the father. Maybe it was Thomas Wayne. Anyway, one of Bruce Wayne's parents were basically descended from the Bat tribe. And so what this meant was that Bruce Wayne solidified his own legacy, essentially. This basically leads to him kind of donning a 1930s outfit, very reminiscent to the old Batman stories from Detective Comics 27 and, from the 1940s, late 1930s going into the 1940s. It is kind of cool. But this, of course, also introduces a lot of information about the parents of Bruce Wayne that weren't readily available before. For the most part, the lives of Thomas and Martha Wayne when it came to DC Comics was not really explored all that often. What this does is it comes along and it basically offers this explanation that Thomas Wayne was not nearly as great as Bruce believed it was, that he was a guy who slept around a lot, that he cheated on his wife, different things like that. Now, this really seems to be fed into the idea that the reputation of the Waynes is being destroyed as opposed to this actually being legit. But notice this, for Bruce Wayne himself, a lot of it just kind of gets ignored. He doesn't really worry about it too much. Instead, in his mind, he knows who his parents are, and that's really the only thing that matters. And so, of course, beginning this investigation, the question has to be asked, if Thomas and Martha Wayne were taken out, then they had to have been taken out by people who were close to them. Now, the reason why this works is because of the fact that, remember, where we know that Bruce Wayne, his parents were killed by Joe Chill because it was in a dark alley, it was a mugging gone wrong, Bruce does not put this together because his memory has been altered. So for him, he's tracking down the murder of his parents. He's trying to figure all that out. Now, of course, it rapidly comes to the idea that his parents were killed in an alley, but more or less it's maintaining the autonomy of the time, because what you're talking about is the possibility that if Bruce Wayne, for example, were to go visit his younger self, it would irrevocably change the timeline. It could potentially alter his own future. And so what he has to do at this point, where these little bits and pieces of his memory begin to come back, and he knows the truth of the murder of Thomas and Martha Wayne, if he acts, it could change the future. So he basically just kind of plays the role that's assigned to him. He does not tell anybody who actually killed Thomas and Martha Wayne. But of course, visiting the Wayne Manor grounds of Thomas and Martha Wayne, of course, checking out the various tombs and so on and so forth, also does continue to offer some insight into the idea that Catherine had basically died in childbirth. Alan Wayne went on to form Gotham City, different things like that, kind of allowed it to develop, so on and so forth. And so what this ends up doing is basically leading into this investigation of sorts, where Bruce kind of takes on this mantle, this outfit that his father wore at various get-togethers, galas, things like that, and it introduces a group called the Black Glove. Now, the reason why I say this matters is because the Black Glove is led by a man named Simon Hurt, and Simon Hurt, of course, as we just talked about, went by the mantle of Thomas Wayne. Now, Simon Hurt appeared at Batman 156 back in 1963, and while his character has played several roles over the course of the Batman publication history, in truth, I would say it was Grant Morrison who probably fleshed out a lot of his history or really made it more intriguing, like what you're seeing right here, this idea that Simon Hurt had been around for quite some time. Now, he played a pretty significant role in Batman's run following the events, really kind of coinciding with this, with Batman and Robin, going into the future of Batman, following this story, different things like that. The fact remains here, this whole ritual that's being conducted by Simon Hurt and the Black Glove is done for the purpose of bringing Barbados into the positive multiverse. Now, again, that was not the original intention, because Barbados didn't exist at the time the story was written in terms of how Scott Snyder's depicting him. Instead, grabbing this information and rolling it over into Dark Knight's Metal, this is basically a part of the Bat tribe that broke off and eventually became the Judas tribe, also known as the Court of Owls. And so basically what this means is that these guys are serving the purpose of worshiping Barbados and trying to bring Barbados into the positive multiverse. The only issue is that Batman doesn't know about it. He has no idea what's really going on here. Again, we kind of have to take Dark Knight's Metal and slap it onto this. We kind of have to offer that conjecture just because of what we've seen in the story so far, different things like that. Again, taking this story for what it is, Simon Hurt's just leading a group called the Black Glove, and his idea is to bring Barbados in, is to take over the name of Thomas Wayne, and then just kind of call it a day. But with regards to Dark Knight's Metal, again, it feeds into the idea that Barbados is trying to find a way into the positive multiverse, and there are people that are trying to bring him here. And so, of course, Marshall Lamar was basically one of them, that she had set him on this path of eventually running into the Black Glove and then ultimately being used as a unwitting member of their group to basically bring him in. And so what ends up happening here is that where Bruce Wayne's able to engineer his escape, and he's sent through time yet again, where he travels into the far distant future, basically to the end of all time itself, the version of Bruce Wayne from the end of all time itself is transported to the present day. And what I mean by that here is, we had talked about in one of the previous videos that by some form or fashion, version, Bruce Wayne was alive at the very end of the universe, and that version of himself, kind of a cyborg of sorts, seemed to be a villain. And so when Superman and Green Lantern and these, the time travelers more or less had come together and try to find try to locate Bruce at the end of time, or at least wait for him to arrive there, this evil version of Bruce kind of locked him in a prison and then jumped back to the present day. What this does is it tells us how he got there. And what we end up finding out is that where Bruce Wayne was teleported to the very, very end of time, that he immediately came across these sort of beings, more or less, that just kind of monitor time itself. They're like the timekeepers, something along those lines, but they're sort of like chronicling everything that's happened over the course of the universe. Now, of course, what this means is that at this point in time, the universe is coming to an end. It's basically at the final moments before the universe goes kaput, more or less. And so with Bruce Wayne arriving here, what ends up happening is he remembers everything that goes on. And this is where we start to get this great big huge exposition on everything that's happened. So if you feel yourself being a little confused, don't worry, we're gonna fix that right now. So essentially what had happened with regards to this timeline of events, just in regards to this story, is that at the end of Final Crisis, Bruce Wayne was thrown to the very, very beginning of time, and then people saw his cloak and cowl and began believing that, there was a bat god out there somewhere. The Bat Tribe formed, Bruce Wayne kept getting thrown forward through time. And as he was thrown forward through time, his memories began to restore bit by bit. And so by the time he was thrown into this far distant future, he's basically remembered everything. The caveat to this is that the monster that was chasing him, the Hyper Adapter, had been sent back by Darkseid for the purpose of eliminating Bruce Wayne. The issue with this is that the Hyper Adapter basically kind of intertwines itself with Bruce's knowledge of who he is. And so as he began to remember bit by bit, the Hyper Adapter would chase after him. And so it's basically followed him all the way to the very end of time in order to ensure that he can travel back to the present day and not have the Hyper Adapter follow him. He's had his memories wiped yet again by these beings, which is the reason why he arrived moments before Superman and all those guys did. And when they first encountered him, he was basically cybernetic and was a villain because his memories had been wiped and he didn't know who they were. And so again, that's why all that really seems to work, is because in this instance, we end up having Bruce Wayne show up, and of course he ends up encountering Tim Drake along with the other members of the Justice League in the modern day. Now, for the most part, because of the fact that he's a hybrid of man and machine governed by a singular purpose, what this does is it brings him into direct conflict with the Justice League themselves, who are trying to find a way to defeat him, just because of the fact that he's basically presenting himself as this extreme enemy. At the same time, you also end up having, Superman and all those guys in the future who are basically using Batman's time capsule to transport themselves, back to the present day. So it's kind of one of these things where all these bridges converge back into a singular location. Now, for his part, Tim Drake actually tries to talk Batman down. He tries to talk reason into him, and it's kind of cool because Bruce Wayne starts to remember different aspects of his past, and his memories sort of start to restore to a degree. The caveat to all this is that as those memories start to restore, then ultimately the Hyper Adapter is going to pursue him again. As a result, where Bruce Wayne is able to take on various members of the Justice League, which culminates in the arrival of like Superman and Green Lantern and all these different guys, this exposition's kind of offered yet again in terms of what it all means and how it all comes together, so on and so forth. Not only that, this energy inside of Bruce Wayne is basically stripped away from him by Superman, who quite literally just kind of pulls it all off. And of course, at that point is put into a time stasis capsule, which of course leads to this energy kind of being sent back to the very early days of man. And it's one of these things where Grant Morrison plays on the idea that all of this is doomed to repeat itself, that all of it's going to happen again. It leads to the first battle between the tribe of Vandal Savage and the Bat Tribe, which explains how it is that Vandal Savage is able to find the Bat Tribe in the first place. So again, it's all these things that kind of feed in. All of this has happened before, and all of this has happened again. What it does is it allows Grant Morrison to basically solidify the story and essentially say that this is doomed to happen. But what ends up taking place here is that following the events of Bruce basically having this source of energy kind of cast off of him, he gets this sort of image, where he's basically, where his life force is kind of stopped, more or less. His heart is kind of stopped by the Justice League. He ends up getting this image of like Darkseid and Metron, things like that, that try to pull him in two different directions. The idea of Darkseid is embrace anti-life energy so that I can be reborn. Basically, it's Darkseid trying to bring himself back. Simultaneously, it's Metron saying, you can't do that. You have to embrace the nature of what it really means to be Batman and accept the truth of Batman. And what this does is it establishes the idea that Batman's never alone. That's effectively the nature of what Grant Morrison was doing with this whole story. It was taking the nature of Bruce Wayne, taking the nature of the anti-life equation, the domination of people's will to live, and kind of rolling it all together into a nice package and reworking Bruce Wayne. So that where traditional stories, a conventional thought would always give way to this idea that Bruce Wayne is a guy who believes that he'll always be alone. Grant Morrison comes along and says, that's not true. In fact, Bruce Wayne always needs people. He needs the Justice League. He needs the Robins. He needs other Batman. And so what this does is it lays the groundwork for the post-return of Bruce Wayne line of stories from Grant Morrison, which go on to basically offer this thing called Batman Incorporated. And this is quite literally a story which is far less complicated than this, where Bruce Wayne travels around the world and starts forming an international Batman team. Basically, all these different Batmen from all these different parts of the world. Now, of course, that all goes into New 52, and it goes into really what's happening right now with regards to like Batman comics and Detective Comics as part of DC Rebirth. One of these really weird stories. This is one of those stories where you're kind of best reading it and sort of digesting it as best you can, because again, we can't run over every single nook and cranny in the story. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.